And now this is the time that you all have been waiting for. Author of Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Thought and Practice, 2014. And 2016 inductee into the U.S. Cooperative Hall of Fame. Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard is Professor of Community Justice and Social Economic Development in the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College City, University of New York. Dr. Gordon-Nembhard is an internationally recognized and widely published political economist specializing in cooperative economics, community economic development, racial wealth inequality, solidarity economics, Black political economy, popular economic literacy, and community-based approaches to justice. Recipient of numerous awards in social economics and cooperative studies, she is a member of the Cooperative Economics Council of NCBA CLUSA, and I'll let her explain what that is. The International Cooperative Alliance Committee on Cooperative Research, a faculty fellow and mentor with the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations. She's also an affiliate scholar with the Center for the Study of Cooperatives, University of Saskatchewan, Canada, and adjunct with the International Center for Cooperative Management, Sorbet School of Business, St. Mary's University, Halifax, Canada. Dr. Gordon-Nembhard is also a past board member of the Association of Cooperative Educators, a past fellow with the Center on Race and Wealth at Howard University, and a member and past president of the National Economic Association. She is the proud mother of Stephen and Susan and the grandmother of Stefan, Hugo, Ismael, and Giselle Nembhard. Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard is our friend, and we welcome her with open and loving arms.
Congratulations, all of you, and congratulations to DVCFSN. I'm so excited to be here, the new building, to see the new co-op. Thank you for having me 10 years later. I was here 10 years ago when my book first came out. You guys are one of the first to let me talk about the book and all that, so I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here. Also, thank you, Mama Honey, for that great libations. You saved me from doing my own ancestor acknowledgement. You did it for me, except that I do have a particular ancestor I want to remember, Alondria Williams. I don't know if anyone of you knew her. They were at Highlander for most of their career. She was a co-op educator, popular education expert, social and economic justice warrior, a Black Lives Matter strategist, and a friend of mine. Today is their birthday. When we picked this day, I was like, oh, good, I can remind people about Alondria. I want her to continue to rest in power. They also would have started us with a song, which I was not going to do because I don't do that, but we already had Mama Hanifa do that also. I'm very proud for that, so I'm just going to take 1 second to remember Alondria especially. And I know that she's in this room with us just as all the other ancestors we called are here. I also want to, I guess I don't need to go through all this, but remember Mother Earth, remember the original stewards of the land, Anishinaabe peoples from here, and I always try to remember the loss of life, right? Gaza, Haiti, hurricane loss, people who have lost their lives from the effects of climate change and geopolitical, social political violence and all that. So we can take a minute to remember that also, but also to celebrate the resistance and all those efforts, the struggles that we've gone through, but we come out on the other side, and using mutual aid and cooperation to resist and to come out better on the other side. So thank you for that. So here we are. I'm going to talk to you about co-ops, food security, and liberation, but it's all about food, as you all know, because you care about these issues. I'm an economist. Because I'm a political economist, I have a little bit of a different notion and definition of economics. For our purposes today, I want to talk about economics as a process and activity for social reproduction, meaning how human beings keep ourselves alive and reproduce ourselves. How do we sustain ourselves and our family? That, of course, starts with nourishment and food, and then moves to land and shelter and livelihood, etc. Economics is about managing the livelihoods of families and of the collective. And of course, it should be for the common good. Some economics, like capitalism, gets hijacked away from that. But we're going to be focusing on the things that connect us and collectivize us. But the other problem is that we work in an economic system that suffers from settler colonialism, which is also about expanding borders, controlling other people's land. You couple that with racial capitalism, which uses white supremacy to provide privileges for some, and then to disregard and take away the humanity and privileges of others, keeps exploiting and oppressing us, keeps us fighting against each other instead of against them. And so you combine that, it looks like we're always struggling just to eat. And you all know this better than I do, right? To grow food, to provide housing, to produce the things that we need, land. And so this is a struggle for control over land. Later on, I talk about Fannie Lou Hamer, but that's what she said also, right? She said they use food weapon. We need to take control back. It starts with collectivizing land and then collectivizing food production. So I know you all are in the middle of that. I'm going to talk about this history from that perspective. I also like to quote the historian Chancellor Williams, who talks about cooperation was the basis of human survival. I now talk about it as the first economic system of humanity, right? It was one of nature's most important schemes for survival. We used collective action to gather food, to hunt, and then we shared what we got with everybody else, right? It wasn't about hoarding or plundering or whatever. So when you look at it, and when I started studying cooperatives in the 90s, I think most of you have heard this story if you've heard me talk, but I talked about how it didn't seem like there were any Black people in it. Everybody talked about co-ops starting in Europe and with codification of values and principles and things like that. But it turns out once you really start to study economic cooperation and co-ops, as I said, the first economic system of human beings, it's also a strategy that has been used by every human population in every era of human history on every continent. And so no one can claim it or tell us that it's either not theirs or that it is theirs, right? It's all of ours. And so these notions of the common good, community, self-determination, mutual aid, etc., we all have it, but particularly early African civilizations, early First Nations were engaged in grassroots economic organizing. And as I said, human beings hunted and gathered together. We shared what we had. We started to farm and build civilizations as together, right? We didn't do this separately, right? And again, under racial capitalism and settler colonialism, we got alienated from that. But also under those systems, revolt was even a collective action. And I have in a second, I'm going to give you a fantastic quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who also talked about cooperatives, but he also talks about how revolt in the Americas was actually the first way we cooperated, because we first had to take back charge of our own bodies. Then we started doing other kinds of economic cooperation. We had to assert ourselves as human beings in all the different ways that we could. And then once we did that, one of the first things we did was share kitchen gardens in the slave quarters when we had a few minutes to tend to things on our own and weren't doing slave labor. Here's the quote from Du Bois: "In the spirit of revolt, which tried to cooperate by means of insurrection, led to widespread organization for the rescue of fugitive slaves among Negroes." Sorry, he didn't have that term enslavement yet. Led to widespread organization for the rescue of fugitive slaves among Negroes themselves. So he's saying we first revolted and insurrected in order to get ourselves out of enslavement. And then it developed into various cooperative efforts toward economic emancipation and land buying. So here we are back to land and emancipation. Gradually, these efforts led to cooperative businesses, building and loan associations, and trade unions. So for Du Bois, and I actually had forgotten this quote for a while, but for him, we can't talk about cooperation and economic cooperation without talking about resistance, revolt, self-determination. So the co-op movement starts with agriculture, food security, land ownership. There was an early interest in co-ops as a strategy for economic survival and independence among Black Americans. I talked about the kitchen gardens. The Underground Railroad can be seen as an economic cooperation system, right? Moving enslaved people to freedom, right? Those people who had wagons used wagons. Those people who knew the landscape used their knowledge of the land. Those people who had some extra food fed the people on the way. So it was a whole interlocking system of solidarity and cooperation and sharing. And then later we became more formalized agriculture co-ops, food, grocery store co-ops, credit unions. Sometimes they were called credit exchanges at first, housing co-ops, worker co-ops, etc. The informal solidarity practices, the barter that we did, the pooling of resources, beneficence, I don't know why it's so hard to say that word, mutual aid, all those things that we started doing were first more or less informal, and then again, the formal co-ops. I think this is actually a repeat of what I already said. Sorry about that. But we got more and more into formality. And so I do want to talk to you first about what we accomplished in this history of exchange while in the Americas, and then I have some specific co-ops. And then I'm going to end with the theme that you'll see Fannie Lou Hamer talks about so well, which is the need for economic justice and economic power in order to gain the political power that we need. And so that gets us to the liberation part. But we know from the work that I've done and others done about how African Americans used co-ops in the Americas, we used them to pool, anchor, and recycle resources, to save costs, to save money, to increase our incomes, and that helped us to increase wealth. Also, wealth is part of asset building, so owning a co-op with other people is a kind of community asset, a way of having asset ownership and building wealth without taking from somebody else. Providing goods and services that were culturally and geographically sensitive and appropriate and affordable, access to appropriate and affordable goods and services. We also used co-ops to help save and create decent jobs in communities, combat the discrimination and the marginalization and the exclusion, to increase our stability economically and our self-sufficiency, group independence, and self-determination. It helped us to develop that collective agency and action that I talked about before, and to practice economic democracy. So again, not just about sharing, but how to share it in a way that reducing hierarchy, reducing exploitation, and really coming together back again as equal human beings, making these decisions, doing this work together. And that also helps to develop leadership. So there's both what economists call market benefits and non-market benefits, right? So the market benefits are all those sort of tangible economic things you can measure. The non-market benefits would be all the human, social capital benefits that we can't measure as well, but are sometimes even more important in a co-op than others. I've been recently studying incarcerated worker co-ops, and when I did some interviews in Puerto Rico, the U.S. doesn't have them, but the Puerto Ricans did, and at least until COVID. And in my interviews, I was trying to get some quotes of them talking about better income that they were making because they were now in a worker co-op and had control over their income. And that kind of thing. But the guys only wanted to talk to me about the social, political, behavioral, psychological, spiritual changes that they went through in the co-op. And these are guys who had 99-plus-year sentences in jail and served 10 to 15 of those years, but got out early, got commuted sentences because of the work they did in their co-op, because the co-op changed them so much. And they were telling me about what a difference it made for them to engage with each other in an equal way where they could actually talk things out, decide together, work together for the common good for other people. And it changed how they saw themselves and the hope they had for how they could continue to live their lives. And that made such a change. As I said, the guys I interviewed all had 99-plus-year sentences. Within 15 years, I believe, of entering prison, they were out, and they all say it was because of the way that they were changed by the co-op. I'm writing that into a chapter of a book, yes. Thank you. I've been struggling with how to talk about it. And I was laughing because I kept going back. I'm like, okay, but did you get better salaries, or were your wages higher? And they were like, oh, we were able to help our families and we did this and we got out of debt, but that's not the point. And these were artists. That was an artist co-op, though one of them was also in a cafe co-op, which was also fascinating. Sorry, this was not originally going to be my topic, but I'll continue. I do have a little bit about the cafe co-op later. But yeah, after his work in the artist co-op, a different prison was starting a cafe co-op, and they had heard about how well he understood the law, the co-op law and things like that. And so they actually asked him if he would be willing to switch prisons to help them start their co-op. And he said yes. And the co-op community in Puerto Rico was able to negotiate with the corrections department to get him transferred to a different prison so that he could help run get start up this new co-op that was a cafe co-op outside the doors of the prison. So every day, the 6 members would go out to their coffee shop, run the coffee shop from 8 a.m. to 3 or whatever, selling co-op food, co-op coffee and co-op pastries, and they made their own sandwiches and stuff. And they also were selling some of the wares from the women's prison co-op next door to them, all in their co-op. And then at 3 or 4, when they closed up, they went back to jail, back to prison. So anyway, really fascinating stuff you can see that co-ops do. Of course, the barriers, you all know that too: capitalization, access to capital, proper orientation and training, both in cooperative economics and business development and co-op management. There's also tons of distrust and excessive competition, especially because we live in an individualistic capitalist world. So we've got to figure out that's also training we need to help people learn to trust each other and learn what can be good about competition and what parts of competition we might want to keep and what we don't want to keep, right? So all that takes time, but you also have to trust each other before you can get to that, understanding that process of learning different things continuously as you go through the co-op development. Ideology, of course, capitalism, individualism gets in the way. We have to leave that at the door. I used to talk about how in our daily capitalist work, we had to leave our humanity and our collectivism at the door. In a co-op, you got to do the opposite. You got to leave your individuality and your capitalism at the door, and come in willing and ready to do this a different way. Class politics and policy can also get in the way. Sometimes even within co-ops, you've got people with different class statuses and stuff. And again, if you don't talk about it and know how to talk about it and figure out ways to have constructive disagreement and trust, you're not going to make it. And then, of course, racism and patriarchy get in the way all the time. And the other barriers, especially for African Americans, has been this history of sabotage, which I noted in the book. I also then wrote an article in 2008 about it as part of an article about why we should consider the sabotage against co-ops as another demand for reparations. So I have an article about that. Because we were Black, because we were going outside of capitalism, right? Often our efforts were thwarted not just by white competition, but by white supremacists, violence, and terrorism. And so there's a whole continuum of sabotage, right? So the really simple sabotage would be a bank not willing to loan or provide a line of credit to a co-op. Or in the old days, the railroads wouldn't transport the produce from a co-op. So that I count as the kind of small level sabotage kind of stuff. Then it gets worse, right? There was a co-op in the 70s in Milwaukee, a cab co-op. They got sabotaged because they were the only cab companies that would go into the Black community. The insurance companies found that a liability, tripled their insurance coverage, and they couldn't afford insurance. And so the co-op went under. So we're getting to middle level sabotage, right? And then you get also on the lower level is just the regular competition. The white store will undercut the price and whatever, put you out of business first, and then they'll hike the price back up, that kind of thing. But then you get to the far level, and that's where the white supremacist violence. There's too many examples of white vigilante groups who actually attacked Black cooperators, sometimes lynching them, sometimes burning down the co-op building if there was a building the co-op was in, that kind of thing. And so I was able to learn about all these different ways of sabotage. And actually, I noticed as I was writing the book that so many of the co-ops like lasted 15 or 20 years that I cover, and some of them only lasted, like the taxi cab only lasted 18 months, right? But most of them, it was all because of one of these sabotages, right? It wasn't really because the co-op wasn't the right thing to do or that people didn't really know. Sometimes they didn't really know how to manage a co-op, so that's why I talk about co-op management, and democratic management is important. So sometimes there could have been better education, but most of the time when you look at it, it was some kind of sabotage, right? Either the rents got picked up too high by the white landowner, or the actual terrorism, or lack of a bank loan, or lack of the government wouldn't honor a loan. In the Pigford case and in some of the southern farm co-ops, they couldn't get a government loan, that kind of thing. I stopped talking about co-ops as failures, because most of the time it wasn't actually a co-op failure. It was these outside forces and capitalism that forced them to fail or forced them under. But the other reason I stopped talking about failures was because of what I just talked about earlier about social capital development and leadership development. There was no example of a co-op that I found that failed, that there wasn't something good that came out of the process of being in a co-op and the fact that the co-op existed in that community. Everybody was better off. They either learned more and started another business or got a different job, or the community learned better, or the community went on to do something more, right? So it was never really a failure in the sense of, oh my God, everything was destroyed, and right, the process was important to go through, and the learning and what people did after that experience was always positive or should be seen in a positive way. So that's the other piece. So I like to talk about what the barriers and problems are, but I also like to talk about it's never a failure to go through this process of humanizing ourselves and humanizing our economy and forcing our economy to change in a way that's for the common good and that's going to make a difference for the common good, because there's always something that happens in that process. So that said, I also I found several periods of time in U.S. history when there were more co-ops, and some of this could just be there were more records that I could find, but I think there are also some similarities between the periods. And now I'm calling 2020s our fourth wave. Actually, Amaha Selassie calls it a fourth wave. I just called it the fourth most prolific period. He said, it's the fourth wave of Black co-ops, fourth wave of Black co-ops. And I was like, oh yeah, that's the way to put it. But anyway, the first period was the 1880s, a really interesting period right after the Civil War, during Reconstruction. It's also a time when the co-op movement, labor organizing, the populist movement, so the caring about every man and laborers and farmers, and even some women's rights and integration, all were working together, especially to counteract the backlash that was happening in the U.S. of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacy. There were also some economic downturns. But this was a period when all these, what we would consider now progressive movements, were all starting and working together and using especially consumer cooperatives and worker co-ops as a strategy to address all the bad things that were happening. Black and white, and some integrated, but some just Black. So I'll talk about a couple of examples from that period. The 1930s and 40s, Great Depression. So definitely a period when people were trying out other things just to survive. And it turns out there were lots of different co-ops, especially in the Black community at that period. And I have a couple of examples from there. The 60s and 70s, not so much at first a period of economic trouble, but by the 70s, the economics starts to get bad for Blacks. But the 60s, remember, is another period where there's a bunch of different social movements happening. And Blacks are connecting civil rights movement with economic rights and doing co-ops in the background. In the foreground is what's being publicized for civil rights, but they're actually supporting the civil rights movement in the background with cooperatives and collective activity and that kind of stuff. So that's an interesting period, and also connecting Black power movement to economic rights and economic power. And then now the 2020s, I'm seeing another similar proliferation. There's lots more Black co-ops starting, especially food co-ops, worker co-ops, at least among people of color, and worker co-op leadership is more Black folks in leadership. There's more money actually for co-op development right now, even though it doesn't feel like it. Proliferation of Black food co-ops. Did I say that already? And, more Black co-op developers. So it's an interesting period. What else did I say? Oh, yes. Active periods of race consciousness and transition, 1880s, 1960s, and 20s. Need for economic independence in order to do political activism, 1880s and 1960s, and maybe the 2020s count for that too. And then in all the periods, all 3 or 4 of the periods, Black organizations focused on economic liberation and deliberate co-op development. That turns out to be really important, and you'll see some of the examples I have, the effect of strong Black organizations. So I want to start with my examples with the Combahee. I used to call it Combahee River Colony until I went to the Combahee River and realized it's called the Combahee River in South Carolina. The interesting thing is, after I covered this, I have a tiny little paragraph about it in the book. But after I covered it, I learned more about Harriet Tubman, and actually it's because of the work Harriet Tubman did during the Civil War to free that area that this co-op collective even happened. So I don't know if you guys know the story of the Combahee River raid, but Harriet Tubman was a Union scout, and she got 2 Union forces. I'm trying to remember. I think it's the 1st Massachusetts. Is that one of the ones that was Black? And then the 3rd Carolina. Anyway, 2 of the Union forces, she convinced their generals. She did the reconnaissance and convinced their generals that they could go up the Combahee River and take over and liberate all those plantations. This is in the middle of the Gullah area in South Carolina by Charleston. And so they actually believed her, and they went, and they liberated, I think it's 750 African people in that area, routed the Confederates, and all the white farmers and their families fled the area, leaving the Black folks behind. The Black men joined the Union Army, and the Union Army moved on. And the women, elderly, and children were left there in all these fertile lands. And the women just took over and started running these plantations, acres and acres of plantation land and farmland. They ran them as collectives. They did collective arts and crafts. And for the rest of the Civil War, they farmed that area together and made it work. Of course, unfortunately, when the Civil War was over, the Union gave the land back to the Confederates. But for that 5 years or 4 years, the women were in charge, and They were doing food security and farming and handicrafts and everything. So that was 1860s, late 1860s. 1886 to 1891, we've got the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union. They actually formed separately. There was a White Farmers National Alliance, but they were not happy with how the white folks were treating them, so they separated off. They also, many of the members had already worked with the Knights of Labor, which was an integrated union, which was doing co-op development as well as unionization and populist stuff. The Colored Farmers National Alliance was actually a populist political party, so they ran candidates. They were a co-op developer, hence the co-op union title. They were a labor union. And the other interesting thing about them was they were a union of Black landowners and Black farm workers. So whoever here is the landowners and the farm workers together. But they realized that the cause was similar, right? They all wanted better working conditions, better prices for their cotton, that kind of thing. And so instead of the landowners seeing themselves as separate, they worked together and they started co-ops, a co-op exchange for lending and co-ops, equipment exchanges, things like that. The other interesting thing about the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union, all the research I could find, the historians kept looking into their membership. At some periods of time and in some states, they had to operate underground, so they never had good numbers. But the best all the historians that I've seen could say is that this organization had over 1 million members. So again, this is the height of the Ku Klux Klan, right? This is all throughout the South during the backlash, again, the rise of Jim Crow, etc. Landowners and farm workers. And to this day, they don't think there's been any Black organization that's had as many members as this co-op, Black co-op organization in the 1880s. So really fascinating kind of history. Okay, so I said that already. Anything else? Okay. Oh, and they were horribly terrorized, especially in Mississippi. There was one report I was able to get where 120 white posse came after the leader, the president of the co-op and two of the leaders, and they chased them all through town and finally found them, or actually through the woods, and found them and lynched them and burned down their building, which housed their newsletter. And they used to share a store with a white national alliance, but the state of Mississippi forbid them from sharing a store. So basically the Black folks were, their co-op got decimated, even though the white co-op still got to exist, but they didn't get to participate or share it anymore. So that's another reason why they went underground. Under those conditions, of course, you would go underground. 1901, the Oddfellows Lodge in Ruthville, Virginia, another interesting example. They had the Mercantile Cooperative Company. It was a company, a co-op store for supplies and groceries. Sold shares $5 each, which is a little high in 1901, but it made sense. They also didn't allow anyone to have more than 20 shares. It was still one person, one vote, but you could invest more if you wanted. They also allowed people to buy in installments, so you didn't have to have the $5 the first day to be a member. So in addition to having the store, they bought trucks to share for the farmers to share, and they actually built an independent Black school because they realized they needed to control the schooling for their children. That co-op lasted 20 years. One of the reasons I think is because it was connected to a fraternal organization, right? The Oddfellows Lodge. So they already had trust and connections and used to working with money together and stuff. But we don't really know why they lasted that long. But the other interesting thing that I found about that one was that they were able to trace the activities in the 50s and 60s in that region for Black folks back to the years of the co-op and the expectations about how to work together, and also the co-op increased the Black quality of life and cost of living and stuff during those periods. And so it was a relatively stable middle-class population, so that when the 1930s, 40s, and 50s when the state of Virginia was trying to do things like stop integrated schools and things like that, this particular community always stood together and withstood some of the assaults against them and that kind of thing. So another interesting connection between long-term co-op culture that gets built and then what that means for civic participation, political efficacy, that kind of thing. A little bit further, Memphis, Tennessee, the co-op meat markets. There was a Memphis People's Grocery Store in the 1890s. That's where Ida B. Wells' friend got lynched. They reconstituted that co-op and this time called it Citizens Cooperative Stores in 1919. They actually raised a lot of money, sold more than they needed to, and ended up in a year having 5 different stores around Memphis and 75,000 members. So again, pretty impressive. 1919, right? Think about your history. That's when the Black soldiers are coming home from the World War I. And what is that? Black August-ish stuff is all this period. But they address these issues through cooperative economics and food again, all around food. There's one of the few pictures I have of a Black co-op that I got from the Crisis magazine. There they are that is in 1919 after they just opened, probably the first store. 1922, quickly, the National Association of Colored Farmers. So that one, again, is a regional organization. By 1930, they actually incorporated as a national organization in Chicago. They had members in 12 states and chapters in 12 states. This was in order to help stabilize Black farm ownership and improve farm living. They did collective buying, but they also did collective, negotiation of prices so that everybody could get. In fact, I found a newspaper article where they were being charged with collusion or something because they were negotiating a better price for the cotton of their farmers than other places. And so yeah, exactly. The news article was saying how bad this co-op was. It was taking dues money and promising blah, 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 and then colluding. And anyway, it's ridiculous. But anyway, they also helped members to purchase farms by getting better contracts and doing credit exchanges again. And you see how effective they were. So you see why the white folks were mad, right? Because they were doing bulk buying. They saved their members 25 to 40% of costs they would have had to if they bought from the white folks, right? They had better credit. They were getting land. So that's why they didn't like it. One example for the Great Depression is Cooperative Industries of DC, a really interesting co-op chartered by Sadie Morse Bethel and Nannie Helen Burroughs. Some of you might know Nannie Helen Burroughs. Not known as a cooperator, she's known as an educator and for starting the Women's Auxiliary to the Women's Baptist Convention, right? But she also started Cooperative Industries. It was first called Northwest Self-Help Co-op, women, helping them doing sewing co-ops, canning co-ops, etc., in the basement of the school that she started. So she used her resources to make sure the co-op could go. And she really wanted women to have better options in domestic service. 1, it didn't pay well. 2, you got sexually assaulted often. And so she wanted women to be able to do production, right, to actually make things, make enough money, have a better quality of life. And so they began as this producer cooperative, a worker co-op, making mattresses, clothing, canning. But then they actually got federal money and bought a farm in Maryland and did farm to people kind of services and ended up with a grocery co-op as well. And really the first, what we now call multi-stakeholder co-ops, because they still had the industrial worker co-ops, but the group together also owned this farm and did the grocery co-op. So a really interesting combination. Fast forward to the 60s, Southwest Alabama Farmers Cooperative Association, again, one of the larger Black co-ops in our history, formed in 67 by Blacks who were going to be evicted from their property as sharecroppers, often because they were involved in civil rights and things like that. So that together they had 1,800 Black farmers who they reached out to during voter registration drives and other activities, got everybody to sign on, and then own land together and buy goods together. They encouraged diverse farming, They were able to increase the money that the members were making on their farming, et cetera, and help members sell their crops better, et cetera. And they become the founders of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which is our longest running Black co-op regional organization. 54, is it 55 years now from 67? What are we up to? Whatever, you do the math. 58 years are they now? Sorry, I forgot to change my slide. Anyway, so the Federation of Southern Cooperatives is our oldest and longest running regional, sorry, not our oldest meaning years running. Have been other regional Black organizations, as I said. And they exist now. They work with hundreds of Black and brown farmers and co-ops. They do mostly marketing co-ops, but they've also done some credit unions, food co-ops, housing co-ops, and some worker co-ops. Let me keep moving. And then also in the 60s, Fannie Lou Hamer. This is also what I'm going to talk about at the very end. Her connection between, she started out as a voting rights advocate and working in SNCC. And then, of course, they almost beat her to death when she registered to vote and started helping other people register to vote. After about a grueling year and a half or more campaign on voting rights, and after the Mississippi Freedom Party went to the National Democratic Convention, and what year was that? In Atlanta in 1968, was that? Or no, 68 was Chicago, wasn't it? It was 64. Yeah, thanks. Freedom Democratic Party could not get seats. They couldn't unseat the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party, but they got their message out about what was happening there. She then changed from being a voting rights advocate to a co-op advocate and started to create Freedom Farm. And I have a great quote from her. Oh, first she did pig banking, which is really interesting. I don't know if you all know about pig banking. You distribute a pregnant sow to a woman to take care of. She gets the sow through its pregnancy, gets to either keep the sow or one of the piglets, and then gives back the piglets to the pig bank, and then other people are able to do the same thing. And so that way every family has at least one pig. They contribute to helping raise pigs for other people to have more pigs, and that was a way to increase income a little bit. So she first started out with that program, and she funded it through the National Council of Negro Women. But then she moved on to we need to own land, farm our own land, and make sure we control our own land so food wasn't used as a weapon. So here's one of her quotes from a speech in the 70s when she was raising money. Cooperative ownership of land opens the door to many opportunities for group development, which develop the total community. So notice the group, the total community, rather than monopolizing, and rather than creating monopolies or monopolizing the resources of a community. And then she said, we need collective land because even if we have no jobs, we could eat and we can look after our families so that food cannot be used as a weapon. Because for her, rights also evicted from her farm with her husband that they were sharecropping because they registered to vote, in addition to being beat and put in jail for that. And so she was saying, okay, we need to really shore up. First, we need to have land and food, right? Then we can start fighting again for justice, right? But if we do it the other way around, they get us, right? Because they control the economics. So let's control our economics first. Let's control our food, be self-sufficient, and then we can move on. So they actually bought up land owned by whites with the money that they raised, put it in the hands of Black, did cooperative agriculture. There was also affordable housing connected, and again, some worker co-ops, especially I think a childcare worker co-op. They originally started with 40 acres and a sewing co-op. And then they eventually bought 640 more acres. Unfortunately, they didn't last more than about 5 years. There was a huge drought 1 year, then too much rain, 2 more years, and then continuously they were bothered by the neighbors and things like that. They also, when I was studying it, I noticed they didn't have a good model for developing a culture of ownership. And so a lot of the members were just expecting somebody else to farm and give them the food and didn't. And then they also at one year, the rain year, they hadn't protected their equipment well enough, so they had a bunch of different setbacks. So it didn't totally work, but you can see why it's still an important model because of the philosophy behind what she was doing and because of the efforts. And as I said, nothing is a total failure, no matter how you look at it. Fast forward to the 90s, just to show what young people can do around food. Crenshaw High School, this is after the uprising against the Rodney King verdict. Had young people trying to figure out what they could do in their neighborhoods, and the teachers started a school project of a school garden in the summer. And then by this time school started, they wanted to continue doing the garden and figuring out how to make a business out of it. So they learned about entrepreneurship and value added and decided to start making salad dressing. They had been giving away a lot of the food that they grew, and they started selling in farmers markets, but they realized if they actually produced something additional, they could make some more money. So they started making salad dressing. They voted that 50% of their profits would be saved, instead of paying out to each student, would be saved for college scholarships. So they were thinking ahead. So they were awarded, over 10 years, they awarded over $180,000 in college scholarships. Their high school actually started a college prep program after they saw that this co-op was giving their students an opportunity to go to college. The other thing that I forgot to put on here is that instead of just selling in their schoolyard, they sold their salad dressing on Amazon. This is 1992 or something, right? These are the first years of Amazon, right? But they realized they needed they were learning entrepreneurship. They were like, there's just so much we can sell in front of the school and at the farmer's market, right? And so there was a time, about a 10-year period, you could buy food from the hood salad dressing off of Amazon. And now here we are in the 2020s, Chai Fresh Kitchen. This is also more of my recent research on incarcerated worker co-ops and worker co-ops for previously incarcerated. This is a Chicago-based group, previously incarcerated women, starting a worker co-op, starting it during COVID. But they had been thinking about doing it before COVID, but they realized they didn't want to wait for COVID to be over to start, but also COVID gave them a great opportunity because they were doing daily, fresh, prepared meals, right? So a time when everybody's on lockdown is a great time actually to launch a business like that. So they made sure they wanted fresh, healthy food. They wanted food that people could connect to, cultural traditions and stuff, so they were able to really get themselves into a niche. So they're still prospering today. And in fact, today they also got into the housing. They bought a building to do cooperative housing because they realized their members also needed housing. So that's another really fascinating aspect here, both the way they're addressing work options for previously incarcerated people, housing options, food, structuring food, that kind of stuff. And then my last example is the one I actually already told you about. I preempted myself. Vencedores Co-op in Puerto Rico is the incarcerated worker coffee co-op shop operating outside the prison walls by people who are still living inside. One of the other interesting things I've been finding in studying the Puerto Rican incarcerated worker co-ops, and there were 5 of them. So the first one that lasted the longest that lasted about 20 years was an artist co-op. Then there was a solar panel co-op. Shoot, I forgot what the third one was. The women's co-op did sewing, and then they had this cafe. Yeah, sorry, I can't remember what the third one was. Anyway, but as I started studying it, I found that one of the really important things for them was the connection with the Puerto Rican co-op community, the co-op ecosystem. So their co-op educator was actually a volunteer from one of the credit unions in Puerto Rico, who also had studied marketing. So she taught them cooperative economics and marketing. For the artist co-op, most of their sales were to other co-ops, to other co-op members and other co-ops. They got invited to the AGMs of co-ops because often it's hard for incarcerated people to do marketing and to have access to the public, right? So this way they had it through the co-ops. The Vencedores co-op, the coffee shop, they got equipment donated from other co-ops. They got a line of credit from one of the credit unions. They got insurance support from insurance co-ops. They got supplies from other co-ops, so all their coffee and tea were organic from co-ops in Puerto Rico, et cetera. And then they were selling the wares from the women's sewing co-op in their store. So they were also connecting. The women's prison was right next door. So they were connecting to the women's prison, which that guy I told you who got transferred so he could help start the cafe, he also had been one of the trainers for the women's co-op. So there were all these interconnections. So really fascinating. And so in the end, the lessons learned are the importance of education, the significance of organizational supports and ecosystems, significance of community involvement, the importance of having access to non-exploitative resources and to pooling resources, the experience with democratic participation, sharing of power, women's leadership, participation of youth all made a difference. And then this connecting racial justice and economic justice. So that's what I want to end on. There were early connections between civil rights activities. And for me, the civil rights movement doesn't start in the 50s. I talk about the long civil rights movement. It started with those slave revolts on the boats coming on the Middle Passage, right? And it hasn't stopped. So it's always been a civil rights, human rights movement. And really, when you look at all those movements, it's always been economic cooperation, solidarity economics, supporting them or behind them or giving some stability to the people who are fighting the good fight, that kind of thing. So understanding that connection and that we can't really have racial justice without economic justice. But in this capitalist society that we're in, we're not even going to get economic justice without the racial justice. So it all has to work together. Fannie Lou Hamer articulated that U.S. food is used as a weapon. We need to collectively own land, grow and control our own food if we really want to be liberated. And even, as we said, when we got the right to vote, we might not have had anything to eat. We were denied access. We lost land. There's a great quote in John Lewis's autobiography. He said the people could vote, but not enough, didn't have enough to eat. This would have been in the late 60s. And his work, he was actually a co-op developer for SNCC in Alabama. And he said, my job then was to help people join together to fulfill those needs, that if we pool what we needed, we could form a credit union, we could band together to buy groceries, feed, seed. So co-ops, again, was the answer, and vice versa. So we can't achieve social, political, environmental, or racial justice without economic democracy and economic justice. But economic democracy and co-ops need racial justice for them to work. And my last quote, one of the many from W.E.B. Du Bois, we can, by consumers' and producers' cooperation, establish a progressively self-supporting economy that will wield our majority of people into an impregnable economic phalanx. He wrote that in an editorial in The Crisis magazine in 1934. But think about that. It could wield the majority of people into an impregnable economic phalanx. So we'd be undefeatable. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so very much for all of that, Dr. Nembhard. So we've been fed, and we've been fed. Let's give it up for Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. Yes. And so one of the things that I thought about as she was talking about education, the relationship between education, our young people, and cooperatives, this project was the vision that came out of the work that we were doing at an African-centered institution right here in Detroit, Michigan, in Soroma Institute. If there had been no in Soroma African-Centered Academy, there would be no Detroit People's Food Co-op. There would be no Detroit Food Commons. Thank you for that. We have time for questions, and I know people have questions. We're going to take maybe 15, 20 minutes for Q&A. We're going to ask that you come up to the mic and ask your question. So if anybody has a question, come on up. Don't be shy.
First of all, I just want to thank you, sister, for this book. I tell you, I bought it in 2014, and it has been 10 years of inspiration for me. It has always been the light and the hope that as when we all come together, we can achieve great things. And so to have it written down is a wonderful thing. So I appreciate that. My question is, we talked about study groups, and what kind of studying goes on when people are preparing to develop a co-op? What kinds of things do they look at? And then don't you think the Detroit People's Food Co-op, Food Commons, would be a great place to start an incubator for study groups for people who have ideas about other kinds of co-ops? Thank you.
Yeah. That's a great question, and thanks. How did you know that I love to talk about education? So I found a couple of things in my research. One, pretty much 95% of the co-ops I learned anything about how they started with a study group. So that was the first thing I said, okay, so that's important. The study group can and does do a lot of different things, right? And I don't mean a study group necessarily to be like a course. Sometimes it was just a dialogue, people getting together to dialogue. One of my favorite examples that I didn't tell you about was in Gary, Indiana in the 30s. Consumer Cooperative Trading Company. They started several teachers and some other Black leaders came together because it was the Great Depression. The last bank had closed. They didn't have a gas station. They didn't have a food store. They came together to talk about what was going on, what could they do. Somebody knew something about a co-op and brought it up, and then they decided to study together. In their case, they actually did start a course in their night school, and then they put a second course in a couple years later on management. So the first one was Introduction to Cooperative Economics. And so they did do a formal study, but they also continued these dialogues and also guilds. So there was a women's guild. In fact, that women's guild was considered the thing that kept the thing going for 10 years because the women were relentless, as we know. So the first thing is just getting together to talk about your issues and talk about what strategies people problem solve. What do you know? What strategies do we have? What do we know? You can go the route of formal education, or you can do informal training. You can also, a lot of the groups did study tours. We know, I have one, there's a co-op in Richmond that started in the late 30s. They went to the Gary co-op. Somebody had heard about it or been to Gary for a different kind of meeting and heard about the co-op and brought somebody from Gary to talk to them, and then took 5 of their members to Gary to learn about it. They also had conferences. The Young Negroes Cooperative League in the 30s held annual conferences. Their first conference was in Pittsburgh in 1932, and do you know they had 600 attendees? This is the middle of the Great Depression. The Young Negroes Cooperative League holding a conference on cooperative business development for Black people. Ella Jo Baker, who's the director of it, gives a speech on the role of Black women in co-ops in Pittsburgh, and 600 people from around the country come to that conference and learn about co-ops and presumably go home and do something. I'm still not sure we've ever had 600 Black folks at a conference, travel to a conference yet since then. The next conference was in D.C., but I think they only had about 400 people. But still, this is, right? Conferences, study tours. We've also, like the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, sent people up to Nova Scotia to study the Antigonish movement, which was doing co-ops through adult education. So that kind of thing. And then the stuff that you guys are already doing, Mama Hatifa's student program she just told you about today, that's another kind of study group. And that's in starting with the young people. One of the things I noticed with studying youth co-ops is when you get the young people involved, you get their parents. In fact, you get the whole family because they all want to come out and help. And if the kids actually start a co-op, they're all going to come and help. Or the kids go home and talk to them about this stuff, and they learn that way. So that's another way to get to the young people, start organizing the young people. So that's what I mean. And then finally, of course, there's a book club. Right? You could actually read books on co-ops and talk about them. So that's another way if you want to be a little bit more formal. I've also seen groups that there's a lot of videos now, so you don't even have to read. You could do a video club and watch videos together and talk about them. I think you guys, somebody told me you guys did something like that last week or something. No, wasn't there? Is that somebody here that told me? We were watching some video together and everybody then talked about it. Anyway, if you didn't do it, it's okay. I know you will. Or, oh, the video. Didn't you say you'd watched a video this morning with the kids? I knew there's somewhere I heard that you guys just done a video watching. It could be a video clip, but again, if you don't want to read, you could do the video clips or small presentations. I've also had study groups where you get people using the library to look back through the news articles and library archives about what happened in their community, and they come up with co-ops and collective activities that they find if they do some kind of archival research. So there's lots of different ways to do that studying that's really about people learning together, because that's another way to build trust and cohesion. If you're going to start a co-op later, it's really good to start with learning together. One, because we need to learn these things and unlearn the other stuff, but also working together and learning together makes us stronger and helps us to figure out what to do next. Did I answer everything? Okay. Yes.
Thank you, Doctor, for your speech tonight. So what it is that I wanted to ask, I know with inflation going up and food insecurity being such a prevalent thing in our community, there has been links between food insecurity and a mental health crisis and how they link together. Do you see any similarities, and how can we as a community advocate for each other and one another as we go through it?
I've been schooled in the food insecurity movement that we really need to call it food apartheid, right? It's because it's really deliberate, right? It's another one of those things. It's a deliberate and a expected consequence of capitalism, especially racial capitalism. So again, one of the things to do to address that is, right, to address the root causes of things, and again, to pool together to figure out both what are the root causes, right? Because sometimes you need to talk to other people before you can figure out what the root causes are, and then together figure out how to address those root causes at the same time that you're immediately solving the problem, right? So again, coming together, pooling resources, that's where buying clubs are often the start before a food co-op. People just pooled their money together to buy what they needed, that kind of thing. So addressing that in those ways, it also addresses your mental health issue, because again, the isolation, so one, the not having enough nutrition could give you health and mental health issues, but the isolation, especially if there's no place to go get good food, you're also, I don't know about the rest of you, but I often see people I know in the supermarket and stuff. But if you don't have a supermarket, or you don't have, or better yet, farmers markets, people always talk at a farmers market, right? But if you don't have that, you're not only not getting the nutrition you need, but you're not getting the social sustenance. So that's the other reason why I love co-ops, is because they address both economic and social issues, right? And they help us to pool together not just financial resources, but human, right? Our human energy, our human activity, our ideas. And so I think the phenomenon you're experiencing, I think, again, cooperatives, collective action, solidarity economics can really make a difference, because it'll help address the immediate nutrition problem with a place that reduces people's isolation and marginalization in a variety of ways. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's how I would think about it.
Hi, thank you. This was amazing. I was very interested in many things, but particularly what you talked about in Puerto Rico. And I'm curious about just saying more about how the system was set up so that they could do the co-ops.
Oh, yeah. Great
inside
question.
it. Yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Incarcerated worker co-ops are very rare. the Puerto Rican model is extremely rare. I haven't really found a model exactly like it except in Ethiopia. So what's the model? I forgot the name of the prison now, but in the early 2000s, there was an art therapy project in this men's prison. I think it's a medium security men's prison. They started getting them to make sculptures and things. And the men actually liked it. They started, the way they tell it, they started giving sculptures away to their families, and their families finally begged them to stop giving them more sculptures. And a lot of them were doing sculptures of Don Quixote and things like that because they liked that notion of a man against the world trying to figure out whatever. So they finally were like, okay, we can't give these away anymore. Maybe we can sell them. So they started looking into what kind of entrepreneurship they wanted, and they realized that some of the sculptures they were actually making together, like somebody would make the stand, somebody else would paint it, and so they saw themselves as doing this together. And so they wanted a business that they could do this together. One of their members had heard about co-ops, and so they actually went to the authorities and asked for co-op education. And luckily, somebody heard that they were asking for it, and so one of the somebody from the Puerto Rican Co-op League said they could come and give them an education. I don't know that person. The person I know was the second educator who came in about 3 years later because the woman was retiring and asked her to take over. And the woman I know was a marketer working in one of the credit unions, and she was able to use volunteer time that the credit union paid for to go into the prison and teach about cooperatives, and especially by then they needed more marketing skills. That's the first thing. When they were ready to incorporate as a co-op, so they got a free co-op educator. When they were ready to incorporate as a co-op, they found out there was this little clause in co-op law that said if you were incarcerated or previously incarcerated, you couldn't be a member of a co-op, especially not a board member. And they were like, but we want to own our own co-op. They did not want outsiders or other people to be their board members for them to have a co-op. So they actually, again, with the help from the Cooperative League, they got an audience with the governor at the time, governor of Puerto Rico at the time. They explained to her what they were doing, what they wanted to do. She put them in touch with the state assembly. They met with a few people, got someone to sponsor a law change, and they got the word incarcerated out of the law. And then incorporated. The thing that they forgot, they didn't take previously incarcerated out of the law, so that's still an issue. But they were able to have their co-op. And then the question is, there were a bunch of other questions, right? People in prison are not allowed to handle money, right? Even when you're doing the slave labor, they keep an account for you or whatever. So they had to fight about keeping the accounts. The same guy who ended up in the Vinceremus co-op told me, because he was president and treasurer at the time of the artist co-op, he said he read all the co-op laws, the Puerto Rican co-op laws, and in Puerto Rican, actually most co-op laws, it said the role, the responsibility of the board, especially the treasurer, is to handle the money, keep the books. So he was able to argue with the corrections people that Puerto Rican law said that if he was a co-op, he, as an officer, had to control the checkbook, had to be able to be a signer in the credit union account that they had, even if the prison had to oversee it or whatever, and had to be able to keep the checkbooks in the office, which they rented from the prison. And they had an office inside the prison that they rented from the prison. So they let him keep the books because he said he would be breaking Puerto Rican law if he didn't follow the rules. Fascinating stuff. They also had an MOU, so they had to pay, first it was 15%, and later they upped it to 25% of their revenues. They had to pay for to rent space, the office space, the computer space, that kind of thing. And then they also got an MOU to be able to send some of their board members out to co-op events to sell their wares, if they also paid for 2 guards to go with them and paid all the expenses of the guards. So they got those 2 separate MOUs. Meanwhile, the co-op community agreed to start inviting them to their AGMs, annual general meetings, and they would go sell their wares there. And some of the co-ops also helped with equipment and that kind of stuff. And then they had enough revenue to buy their own supplies and that kind of thing and set up shop. So it was really fascinating. So that was the artist co-op. I don't know as much about any of the other co-ops. I know the women's co-op, once they started, they got the education from the same educator, but then she brought some of the guys from the art co-op, like the president I told you about, and they helped to train the women. But she said the women's prison was much harder to do this. They didn't have as much programming for women's co-ops, so even to do the education required like a special effort. They did a whole business plan for them to do a bakery, and then the prison decided they wanted to do the bakery themselves. So the women had to pivot to do sewing, but they were able to get the sewing machines donated from some co-ops, and they learned sewing, and so they started doing sewing. Then the prison transferred half of their members to a different prison. So then they had to regroup, and then they put their president in solitary. So then they had to negotiate 2 extra hours for her to be out of solitary to attend business meetings for the co-op. So anyway, lots of interesting stuff. And then they all got shut down during COVID, and they haven't been able to get them back going yet. But the weird thing is they were actually making money off these co-ops, because when they were making 15 or 25% overhead or whatever, they were actually bringing in money. During when Puerto Rico had to go under austerity, when was that? About 8 years, 10 years ago or something? They tried to tell the artist co-op that they couldn't go out to sell their wares anymore because there wasn't enough money. And then the president reminded them that they were bringing revenue into the prison, right? They were paying for their own costs and giving them 15% of their revenues. And then the warden said, oh, yeah, you're right. I guess we can't say that there's no money for you to do this. So then they let them go back and sell. So it's really a fascinating model. But how to get it in other places is really hard, because not every place has the flexibility, and not every place has a strong co-op ecosystem of support like they have. And then, as I said, the ones that got out have had a problem because they can't necessarily start their own co-ops outside. They can join another co-op, but right now they can't have a wholly previously incarcerated own co-op. But they're working on changing that. And they did create a hybrid co-op, again, just before COVID. But then COVID ruined everything, because one of the prisons was closed down totally, and everybody in that co-op got scattered. And they're now fighting the battle to get the prison to allow the co-ops to start up again.
Okay, so I have 2 questions. You want me to ask one at a time?
Yes, please.
Okay. You were talking about Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm a little tall. You were talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, and her things happen where economic equality was just as important. What did you say, and can you elaborate on it a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, so basically she said, okay, she spent all these years on voting rights, and it only got them so far, right? A lot of her experience with voting rights was being evicted from the land she was sharecropping, being beaten by police. As I said, when the Mississippi Freedom Party that she helped create went to try to get representation at the Democratic National Convention, they wouldn't listen to them, though the year after, the Democrats kind of changed and wouldn't allow segregated Southern Democratic delegations anymore. But still, she felt like they didn't really get very far, right? Even when they had this concerted effort, the whole country was on their side. JFK was supporting voting rights, right? But also, just John Lewis said, even if you got the right to vote, it didn't solve the poverty issues, right? People were still starving, not getting food. So I combined both what she was saying about her experience in voting rights and what John Lewis was saying. He actually also had worked on voting rights first and then co-ops afterwards. And basically what they were saying was you can't get far enough. Voting rights are not enough. We can't do just having the right to vote doesn't solve all our problems, because we also have economic problems, and co-ops can solve that problem, and they can help us be stronger politically. So both of them started arguing for get our economics let's get economic independence, liberation through cooperative economics so we can control our own land, control our food production, control our jobs, get the things we need. Then we'll be stronger and more stable so that when we do try to vote or try to do other things for civil rights, they can't retaliate against us economically because we'll have our own structures, our own ownership. They can still, in some ways, we know they still retaliate economically, but at least it's harder for them if we own our own land, we're making our own food, if we're not as beholden to them. So that was the notion. And so I then made that into this notion about the interconnection between economic justice and racial justice and political justice, right? They all have to work together. One is never going to liberate us, especially because of the kind of societies we live in. We've got to really work on all the fronts. For me, starting with the economic justice front, I think is even more powerful, but it's clear that we can't only do one front. We have to work on multiple fronts if we're really going to be liberated.
Thank you, Mama Hanifa. Thank you so much for the presentation. I was curious if you could speak a little bit on being in this capitalist society and also this non-extractive resourcing that we're talking about. If you can talk about the startup costs and how do we practice being out of capitalism, sometimes like using capitalist funds or extractive resources to start these co-ops, or that relationship and that toe in the line that has to be done. If you can speak to maybe other ways that people resource the startup of these co-ops. Thank you.
Yeah, one of my organizations, Grassroots Economic Organizing, GEO.coop, we actually did a financing from within or from within the movement kind of study to look at different ways. And I started looking back at some of the examples I had. So financing is always a problem. Thing that's so exciting about co-ops is that we pool resources, right? We all put in our dues or whatever a little bit, and we can leverage that to do something else, but it's still not enough, especially in the 2020s. So the first thing is to think about how we can rely on ourselves. So even silly things like being able to pay in installments. I know in the 30s that there was a co-op in New York City that had dance parties, right? And used the cover, cost for the cover to help raise money for their co-op, right? There's housewarming, the house parties kind of thing. So you can think about that for small amounts, right? And then there's definitely groups like I've been part of the Southern Reparations Loan Funds, which is a set of local community co-op loan funds. They actually see grants as reparations. They're not against getting the grants. It's what you do with them. So for us in the Southern Reparations Loan Fund, which is also part of the New Seed Commons Collective, which is non-extractive, right? So you pull in the grant money from all those horrible people, but what you do with it is you do non-extractive lending, meaning you lend it out to co-op groups or startups, but with the understanding that they only pay it back when they're able to, and you don't really charge interest. You might have to charge some administrative fees, but mostly they're just paying back the principal, but they're paying back the principal when they're strong enough to do it. So paying back the loan isn't going to undermine the co-op. And sometimes the loan can be forgiven, especially if the co-op doesn't make it, then you're not in debt to that loan. But of course, they also do as much as they can to help you succeed because they want you to pay it back so they can lend it out to the next person. So that's what we mean by non-extractive finance. And that is one way to recycle, right? To get the quote unquote reparations money from the big foundations and nonprofits and stuff, but then filter it through this local community loan funds that are non-extractive so that co-ops can really use it well, but also it can be reused once it's paid back. So that's the notion there. So still do as much internal, raising the money yourself as much as possible, but then try to be connected to a format. And then the last thing would be if you have to take an extractive loan, take it if you've got a good plan for how you think you can make it work and still pay it back. But try all these other kind of options first so that we get out of that loop, right? It's almost like trying to be off the grid. Right, with electricity, this is with finance, trying to be off the grid as much as possible.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciated the framework you provided around and the reframing that co-ops don't die because they're not successful, but because they're sabotaged, and the different levels of sabotage. And I was curious across the different case studies if you found common practices of co-ops around anticipating potential sabotage and how to prevent it or even protect against it.
That is a great question. I don't have a great answer. I'm trying to think of some examples. One of the protections is to get non-extractive finance, right? So you're not beholden. I have seen some groups that had a backup plan of if a loan was called in, they had some friends, neighbor, family who would all pitch in short term if they needed to so they could pay off that and not be in debt. And then honestly, the best way I can answer that question is not with a deliberate strategy, though I think you're right that we should be thinking about deliberate strategies. But one of the strategies I saw that wasn't specifically about that, but was like that was one of the, what do you call it, residual benefits of what they were doing is the co-ops that had more connections with their communities. So the community knew they were a co-op, knew what they were doing, wanted them in their neighborhood. Those co-ops, the neighbors came to their defense, whether it was in some cases with guns, circling the co-op with the co-op members, or with patronage. I'll come and be a customer or a generous loan or something like that. But when the community knew what you were doing and was supportive of you and you had a good relationship with the community, that was one of the best ways to defend the co-op.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, I had a question about real estate cooperatives.
Okay.
In terms of, I know this is around food security, but one of the other things that Detroit lacks is services and products within our own neighborhood sometimes. So utilizing that community investment trust, have you found a lot of case studies around that?
There's not a lot of case studies yet, but there are some great examples. The East Oakland Real Estate Co-op, they've been doing some great stuff. If you look them up, there's some coverage, and I think their website gives you some stuff. I think that's what they're called, East Oakland Real Estate Co-op. Does anyone know them? Is that their name? Permanent Real Estate. Also, the Boston Ujima Project, they have 3 different kinds of community investment projects, community ownership, and I'm sure their website explains that well. And I'm trying to think, there was one other. Yeah, those are the 2 best. It's not my expertise. I've been just learning about them too. But there's definitely a movement to try to figure out. Oh, and then community land trusts totally takes it out of speculative market, right? You create, basically it's a community-owned nonprofit that owns the land, but I've seen a lot of great combinations, right? A community land trust with co-op housing on top, or a community land trust with a community business or a co-op. Yeah, this is, you have to pick the kinds of members who should be on the board of a community land trust. You have to be very clear about who they should be, and your bylaws have to be very clear about if and how to divest and that kind of stuff. Isn't a community one? Yeah, oh, it's a government land trust, right? So community land trust would be the other way to go. So it's not exactly ownership in the sense of even a co-op privately owning it, but it is a really good strategy, especially if we want to take land out of commodification, right? Because then you don't worry about speculation or market value at all. It's just it's off the market in that sense. And then, right, which is how most of the public ones work, right? Yeah. So I think those would be my examples.
This is so exciting. I don't get to be in these conversations much, except for inside of my job. There are several resources in Detroit, outside of this beautiful place that we're here. There is activity in community land trusts, different from the Detroit Land Bank, and the Detroit Justice Center is doing a lot of that work right now. So there's a resource for you in that space. There is a Seed Commons locally here. It's the Detroit Community Wealth Fund in Detroit that exists. They do non-extractive loans and grants. That's another resource for you right here locally. I'm actually running the Center for Community-Based Enterprise. We do co-op development, although we're more focused on existing businesses and transitioning them into worker ownership. But that's another resource, and know about these things that she was listing. So I'm just throwing out, and there's one more in Southwest Detroit, Grace in Action Collectives. They work particularly with youth, forming co-ops in Southwest Detroit, specifically as place-based. And they've already formed, each group has formed several cooperatives already. So these are resources right here in Detroit. Just want to let you know that things are, of course, the Detroit People's Food Co-op is one of the hugest one with all of the activity that led up to it. But there's lots of little ecosystems things growing up around the city.
Thank you all so very much. It's quite a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate it. Congratulations again, and keep up the great work.
All right. This has been wonderful. And I know you all are not ready to go. I'm not ready to go. I could probably listen for another hour, but it's been a day. We've been fed, and we want to just give another round of applause to Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard for coming and sharing her knowledge with us. And I know that all of us will have something that we will take home and do some further study. Okay, so thank you all again for coming. Many of you may know that we have transition leadership in the Detroit Black community. Food Sovereignty Network, Malik has stepped down. He is on sabbatical. But one of our co-directors, don't you even try, one of our co-directors, phenomenal, Dr. Shakira Tyler. And I'm not going to let her get away without coming up here and saying a few words.
But thank you for coming out. This is with the relaunching of the What's for Dinner lecture series of the Detroit Black Community Food Sovereignty Network. Thank you for joining us in this space, and extraordinary gratitude to Dr. Gordon-Nembhard. I've read your book at least 5 times. And please, if you have not purchased her book, Source Booksellers, I believe, has it on the shelves, which is a local Black-owned bookstore, and other online Black providers also do. Please don't purchase from Amazon, please. Thank you. And I'll end by saying that for me, Black cooperative development is a huge part of Black food sovereignty. It's the only way that we're going to beat capitalism and white supremacy, or white hegemony for that matter, at its own game. It's our only way out of the system, y'all. So Black co-ops are, to me, like the core part of the work. It's a massive undertaking, but as you can see, it's worth it, right? The Detroit Food Commons is meant to be an example of the beauty and the victory that Black cooperative development looks like. And we know this history now through the research that Dr. Gordon-Nembhard has done. So let's please love one another up, and let's continue to be in community together, because this work is ultimately just about caring for one another. Like mutual aid and caring, like developing these ecosystems of care is so important, because it's not just about working together, but it's literally about building the village so that everyone feels held, everyone feels cared for. And that's a huge part of co-op development that we often forget about sometimes. So thank you for coming out.